Change comes in 1,000 different ways, but never in a hurry or by unanimous consent. I think that's one of the most important lessons that I've learned over the last 15 years. For the longest time, I thought that the best strategy for effecting change was through accumulating critical mass. If we could just get more people to buy into a particular idea or a concept, more people working together on a particular idea, that change would be sure to follow. The problem is that critical mass is generally content with the status quo, no matter how much they complain or dream otherwise. It's just as true of the church as it is of business, politics, or any other endeavor. The middle of the bell curve, with all of its critical mass, will never champion paradigm shifts and radical change. That's a fact to me that seems to be baked into the very essence of human nature. What I have seen both historically and in my own experience is that most paradigm shifts come from the critical mass, not from critical mass, but from critical yeast. I want you to think this morning and over the next 2 days in those kinds of terms. What does it look like when critical yeast, that small fermenting part, gathers together and begins to try to leaven the whole loaf, as opposed to trying to get masses of people together around radical ideas? What I have found is that it comes from individuals with an idea that is usually described as too intellectual, too idealistic, or just too complicated, and then simply dismissed by the critical mass. I can't tell you how many times I've had people tell me that, Tom, you're just too intellectual. I mean, the whole thing that you're talking about is it just seems too complex. As if our God is a God only of simple kinds of things. If we look at the world in all of its complexity and we believe that he's the designer and the creator of that, why is it difficult for us to think that God would work in complex ways and that he has given us the abilities, both collectively and sometimes in our own particular domains individually, to begin to tackle complexity? What if the church began to believe that it could actually tackle that kind of complexity? But what I've also found is that the critical yeast, they just plug away, usually in isolation, through countless iterations of trial and error on their way to what Walter Brueggemann called futures that are genuinely new and not derived. He goes on to say, Brueggemann that is, that prophetic imagination proceeds through 3 basic steps. The first is that it refuses denial and penetrates despair with the honest cries over pain and loss that result from social injustices. And if you just look around the world of Christian missions over the last 20, 25, 30 years, you see the emergence of things like the Christian Community Development Association. You see other things that have developed along the way in which the church was saying, it's not enough to simply preach the hope for the hereafter. What would it look like if the church began to tackle the social injustices that exist in our world? What if the church began to look in terms of the material poverty that people deal with as well? And what is it that we have to say about that alongside of our message of a hope for the hereafter? That the prophetic imagine begins by saying, I'm no longer going to simply live with the status quo. There must be something more. And we begin to imagine what it might look like if we tackled these things in a different way. Brueggemann goes on to say the second step is that prophetic imagination overcomes amnesia by drawing on ancient artistic traditions that energize the community to imagine and live into a more just order. Remembering that we are a part of a community, an historic community that has believed deeply in redemption, and that the redemptive process is not just for the hereafter, but it's also to be involved in working with God to bring redemption to all that he has created, both material and otherwise. And then he goes on to say that it ends, number 3, prophetic imagination ends in the hope and gratitude for the surprising gift of an emancipated future. One of the things I love about the Sat Talk presenters that we bring in every year is that these are folks that have imagined a way that the church could be doing things differently. And we celebrate the successes. They share their stories filled with trial and error, filled with difficulties along the way. And yet there is this inkling of hope oftentimes much more than an inkling, because of the good things that we see happening through their endeavors. When it comes to the idea of church missions and sustainable solutions, the answer we seek are not derived from the safe and co-opted practices of traditional church missions. Those practices have served their legitimate purposes and must now learn to serve an even higher purpose. Unfortunately, most churches will be content to simply mend and fend their mission efforts as a part of their brand management in order to demonstrate that they are a caring church and keep their market share of a seeker-sensitive population demanding positive volunteer experiences. I had to write that sentence, and I've been itching to say it for a long time. I thought about putting it on a screen, but I'm not sure I want to be quoted. But deep inside of me, if I'm honest, and the folks that I hang with and the presenters that are here would either openly or probably at least secretly agree that to some extent the church has treated missions as kind of a part of their brand, their identity, so that the community sees them as caring people. And I just challenge you for a second to think about how objectifying that is. Play it out. Play the logic all the way out in your mind, all the way to the very people that any church would seek to serve. If that is in order to demonstrate that we are a caring church, have we ascended to the highest motives for why we would do these things? Have we not settled for things that are less than what they ought to be? So I'd like to share a word, just a thought, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, in particular to pastors in the church in general. Prophetic imagination requires us to understand the shifts that are going on in the world of church missions, especially in the context of poverty and marginalized people. Otherwise, if we don't, the church is going to be left behind. This is meant to be much more than just a warning. It is, in fact, an incredible opportunity for the Church of America to regain credibility and influence through authentic and practical forms of missions work that actually help people in communities lift themselves out of poverty. This challenge and opportunity I'm suggesting can best be demonstrated in a couple of research projects by the Barna Group. Most everyone would agree that two of the top challenges facing pastors today are the lack of influence and the need to rebuild credibility. This includes not just credibility gained by avoiding hypocrisy, but also the credibility and influence that comes from being a constructive force in the world. In a 2017 Barna Group report entitled "The State of Pastors Leading in Complexity," they state this: people seem to trust pastors when it comes to overtly spiritual topics, but are less confident in their counsel on more everyday, close to the ground issues. It also states that slightly less than 1/4 of the population holds a positive opinion of pastors. Now, I am one. With an equal number who say pastors hold little or no influence in the community. To hold that thought and fast forward to a July 2018 report that Barna put out entitled "The Good News About Global Poverty." And in that, they stated that 88% of the American public highly value the opinion of a pastor regarding global poverty, noting the apparent contradiction between their two different reports. One saying that the church and pastors have little or no influence, a year later saying that 88% of the world is looking for pastors and churches to give some insight and some direction to this. Barna then says, in some ways, the trust that American public places in pastors' opinions of poverty presents an increasingly rare public platform for ministers. Previous Barna research underscores a sort of cultural credibility crisis for pastors, showing that just 1 in 5 U.S. adults sees Christian clergy as influential in their community or as an esteemed voice on important issues. Yet, pastors have an incredible potential to lead the charge and position the church as a powerful force in anti-poverty endeavors. And then they end it with saying, pastors, whether you like it or not, there's an opportunity. We're beginning to see stories and pictures of people all across the world stepping into this space and believing that they can do something in this regard. So let me get back to critical yeast and the prophetic imagination and where we want to go in these next 2 days. There is a critical yeast at work in the world of church missions. There is a small and growing band of individuals and churches that are genuinely wrestling with what church missions could be and must become in order for the church to regain relevancy in our culture and around the world. I'm convinced the best thing we can do is create the space and opportunities for critical yeast to gather and share their stories as well as what they're learning. That kind of format admits that there are no experts. Please understand that. None of us are experts here. None of the presenters would call themselves experts. We're just sojourners, willing to step out in some kind of prophetic imagination and try things, risk things, iterate things, because we believe that God means to be a redemptive force in all aspects of this world and in our lives. If we create space and opportunities for critical yeast to gather and share their stories, as well as what they're learning, maybe it will inspire more of the church and eventually make its way to the middle of the bell curve. That kind of format admits no experts, it accelerates the learning curve for all, and it gives a sense of welcome belonging to people who are hungry to be around others who get them. I think one of the other delights of this time over the past 4 years is that we've been able to have round tables of presenters to talk about things that they're learning, and other folks involved in our peer learning communities and Mission 3.0 workshops and so forth. And just being with folks who are already convinced that the church could do this, not asking whether or not we should or could, but with a deep belief that we must. And those conversations take a very different approach. They go in very different directions. That's what we've had. We created Sat Talks for all of these reasons, the space for the critical yeast who think church missions and sustainable solutions must go together. That's our niche. We help churches that want to reframe their missions work around sustainable solutions and create room for business-minded people who can help that happen. Another quote from Brueggemann that I just so appreciate is he's talking about the idea of prophetic imagination. He said, "Thus my accent on imagination." He was referring back to things that he imagined as he stepped into the things that he was working with. I found it to be true myself. I found it to be true with so many of the presenters I've talked with, that we started down this road with a kind of an imaginative thought about what could be. And as we look back, we find that our imagination, the things that we imagined God could do and would do, turned out to be true. And so Brueggemann says, "Thus my accent on imagination has turned out to be exactly correct. For what is now required is that a relatively powerless prophetic voice must find imaginative ways that are rooted in the text, rooted in the scriptures, our understanding of who God is and who he's made us to be, but that freely and daringly move from text towards concrete circumstances." That's why we invite these presenters. Individuals that have had a prophetic imagination rooted in the scriptures, but have left that, not left that, but have taken that and begun to create concrete expressions of what it might look like. So as you hear the other 10 presentations over the rest of today, you're going to hear concrete expressions of prophetic imagination that believes that God means to be as much the hope for the here and now as we know him to be for the hereafter. Thank you for being a part of this year's Sat Talks.